So I finally got around to making the next part. I got some surprisingly good reception from friends on the first part of the series, as well as a handful of strangers that stumbled their way along the algorithm. This compelled me into creating another part a little bit faster. For those that have forgotten or inexplicably started with this second part of the video project, the point of the series is for me to play the favorite games of a lot of my personal friends and form opinions on the game itself, as well as how it circles back to them in my own mind. The overall narrative is going to probably remain eternally inconsistent and rambly, but if that's what people want, I have no issue presenting more of my lack of focus. You don't even want to see my senior paper from college. As a refresher for the rules and conditions, the scope of this project is only single-player games, as online multiplayer games would be a different beast entirely and kinda hard to nail down to a theoretically infinite ceiling. In addition, I don't necessarily have to 100% or beat the games, especially for the ones I've already played before in my life. In the previous part, we covered 3 of my friends, Trevor with Hollow Knight, Dean with Pokemon Emerald, and Billy with Wario Land 4. We rounded it out with one of my favorite games, the Mega Man Zero series, though focusing primarily on 2 and 3. I think the structure works pretty well, the whole 3+1 thing, so we'll stick to it for this part until I feel the need to maybe shake it up in later videos. For consistency's sake, I'll display some of my favorite games again before we hop in right here. With that aside, let's get started with more of my friends' favorite games. If you're looking at the timestamp description and see myself, it's not me, but rather my friend that goes by myself, though we call him Thuggie, so we're gonna just use that instead. It's kinda like how some friends in your online group you call by their first name and others by their handle still, it's just kinda what feels right. I think I made it apparent at the beginning of Billy's section in the last video, but I was never a Nintendo kid in a time where it felt like so many peers were. This is the only game I never heard of in the initial responses, let alone played. I at least had an idea or two for the other responses, so I was really excited that I'd get an entirely fresh initiation into a game that means so much to a good friend. Oh, and a minor backstory on how we came to meet him, because I think it's kinda funny. When I have enough of these bad boys in the bloodstream, I become someone who might actually type in all chat for once, and in this case it was Dota 2. The game was like any other, and I typed one of my famous "See me in Melty Blood" brand sentences, only for the first time to receive the answer, "Okay, bet." After that game concluded, and we did win by the way, I'm petty enough that that is necessary information. We added each other and played some Guilty Gear Exard and Melty Blood Actress Again current code. That person was myself, or Thuggie, and we've been playing games together since. I also want to apologize in advance that for those that don't know, this game's actually pretty long, and I just sort of stopped recording after a certain point since these videos take a tremendous amount of raw recording space, so I'm sorry if it gets a little redundant visually. So what made one of the people I hit buttons with the most decide that Mario and Luigi Superstar Saga is his favorite game? I desperately need to get something out of me, a demon if you will. It took me nearly 20 minutes to finish the tutorial because this man is absolutely schmoving. Admittedly, at first I thought this was just a standard platforming style Mario game, but was incredibly delighted to realize a few minutes in that it's an RPG. I've played the GameCube Paper Mario and a tiny bit of the actual Mario RPG, and if I have to be honest, I vastly prefer the Mario universe in this style. While I have a pretty strong bias in favor of RPGs, and especially turn-based JRPGs, I just feel like Mario as a character has infinitely more personality and flavor in these games compared to the platforming ones. I don't have a great way to describe it, and I hope even just one person knows what I mean, but Mario feels more like a guy in a world in the RPG-style games as opposed to the guy in the world in the platformers. I mean this in the sense that in the platformers you watch the world shift, contour, and move in reaction to just Mario existing in the general vicinity. The stages feel like something created explicitly for Mario, whereas in a game like this, he just happens to be an inhabitant. If that's just my own personal type of brainworm, feel free to ignore that. Honestly, playing all these Game Boy Advance games so far into this project, Japanese devs were absolutely on one for making absurdly emotive sprites. I demand that you pay extra close attention to the sprites in this video, and I am not asking. Being the third Nintendo-made game I've done so far in only 2 parts, I think wandering around the world in Mario and Luigi Superstar Saga has finally given me the genuine, yeah, this is why Nintendo games stick in people's brains their entire life from a young age. The art style is just near timeless, and likely a large reason a majority of the Nintendo system emulators, in my experience, are the most meticulously usable and convenient ones. Everyone just wants to go back and play their favorite childhood games without having to put on a sticky pair of nylon gloves and peel away a layer of crust or two to be taken back to that time period. This is a luxury us PlayStation 1 childhooders don't really have. Plenty of games I've gone back to on PSX have aged, questionably. Where one man can boot up Mario and Luigi Superstar Saga and be immediately snuggled into this visual candy shop, I open Alter Echo, which is a PS2 game even, and All this and, well, the fact that Nintendo doesn't want people to know they even make video games before whichever current console they're working on and, God forbid, have easy access to them. The beginning setup to this game's narrative is pretty unique, at least to me. I'm sure fans could probably point at a dozen games where you team up with Bowser, but it was a first for me and it was a pretty goofy romp. For those that weren't aware, the game begins with Princess Peach getting her voice stolen from two villains, Cackletta and Popple, and Bowser doesn't want to kidnap her in that state, so teams up with Mario and Luigi to go to the BeanBean Kingdom in order to get it back. The really casual team up and interacting with Bowser's grunts like nothing's weird about the whole situation was genuinely fun. I know Mario games are primarily marketed for children, but in my experience it's been a very sanitized, no-frills transaction, at least in my memory. The humor and expression of this game surpasses that expectation, dipping into what I'd even call crude, or as crude as you can get for a Mario game. Refusing to do any semblance of research for this video, I'd like to think of this as the Attitude Era of Nintendo before excruciating and tedious resolve and covering some tattoos that weren't even embarrassing or incriminating. As a big fighting game fan, Mario & Luigi Superstar Saga is sometimes a more frustrating game than the game after this, strictly because every single time you take damage, with the exception of your first encounter with a new enemy I guess, you fully understand it was your own fault. This didn't prevent me, an online dweller, from stumbling upon plenty of outdated forums discussing how absurdly easy this game is though. In this, one of the takeaways that has beckoned me the strongest was shown to me this early on, but there's more stuff I want to talk about before just reaching a conclusion on why this game means so much to Thuggie. One of the sentences I had to erase multiple times in the Wario Land 4 discussion last video was habitually mentioning background change cool, and it was just as welcome here. I know there's a certain satisfaction, especially among the modern near demand of open games, that we can gradually travel from A to B and be able to write an entire lore video about how you notice the grass getting shorter until a layer of frost slowly accumulates onto settings that you probably have disabled anyways, and gives way to a snowy, probably north on the minimap biome. Every time I walked through a single cave exit or something similar in this game, all I could do was look at the violently new environment and think, oh shit, what new stuff is here? I'm genuinely embarrassed to think about how it took me a handful of tries to understand one area of the map where I had to steadily mash to float from island to island. The cynical side of me wants to comment on how these shifts are for kids to stay invested by seeing new thing after new thing, but the less stupid side of me sees it as a group of people wanting to stub their thumbs, cramming the 33rd bit into the 32nd of a cartridge on the way out of the door. This is displayed best in my opinion by some of the bosses in the game. One such instance is Dragahoho, a dragon boss pretty early into the game. A bit into the fight, he'll start spawning platforms halfway between you that he will jump to for the next turn. For the player turn, you're then faced with an option: destroy the platform so he stays further away, effectively making his attacks much easier to dodge and recognize, or ignore the platform and hope you're good enough at dodging to just quickly dump damage into the boss and end it quicker. While in many games I just refer to this as the boss gimmick, I don't think it's what I'd really use for this game. With the aforementioned constant shift of environments, enemy music, and so on, the bosses just feel like another permutation. That being, it feels like the developers just had so many creative and fun ideas to pack into the experience that's just one of many little fun ideas they came up with by the water cooler. It feels like you could almost completely randomize the bosses and areas, and I wouldn't have noticed with a few thematic exceptions. I think it's really beautiful to sort of encapsulate the toy box experience for the players, like a kid spending a rainy afternoon faking a war between various stuffed animals, action figures, and RC cars on a chaotic, sprawling living room carpet. I would like to think this is the last pretentious thing I'm going to say in this game section, and in honor of my buddy who values mechanics as much as I do, let's talk about rhythm games. Oh, you thought I meant actual rhythm games? I already addressed that bit in the last video when discussing muscle memory and its consequences. I meant the closest we can get to rhythm in a similar RPG environment. I want to preface this portion with the idea I had after painstakingly watching the first part of the series and consistently wishing I'd poured a little bit more of myself into each section. I contained a good chunk of my passion into only the last game revolving around me, and don't think I can particularly do that anymore. If the series continues to be long form, I want to selfishly shill in an overly opportunistic way. I will now hard cut to footage of Yakuza 7. As an individual with the hall pass of playing every mainline Yakuza game, it took exactly this one game to sweep every prior entry under the carpet. While I admit I'm biased towards turn-based combat, which seems to be increasingly rare, I can't think of many games with a more earnest and dorky heart than this. While I'm 26 at the time of this video, hopefully, I adore controlling some middle-aged burnouts and losers in their earnest journey to do the right thing. Ichiban might be one of my favorite game protagonists of all time, and personally I think he fits the Yakuza storytelling style of serious main cutscenes but insane left-field minigames and side quests just a little bit more than Kiryu. I think in this game the quick-time events sort of represent, quote, getting your groove back, and I'm not someone who can really ignore that type of flow state in any game, show, movie, whatever. While mechanically you're only really gaining damage and maybe ailment chance up, even such a small bit of interaction makes the combat feel much more weighty and involved. One example is having to mash a button to charge up before doing a big attack, or maybe a tight timing in the final blow to knock them further into a damaging area of the map. This also extends to hitting a button and timing of you getting hit to reduce the damage taken. Of course, Yakuza 7 isn't the first game to try anything like this, and I added the next few lines here because I quite recently 100% all of the Utawari Ramono games, and wanted an excuse to show a tiny snippet of footage, because Mask of Truth might be one of the best things I've ever played in my entire life. Mask of Deception and Mask of Truth even adds secret crit spots for timing on some attacks that aren't indicated that could be the difference of making it out of the weirdly difficult post-game content. For the record, I only had to cut my webcam once that I couldn't hide I was crying in a work meeting while playing that game. Back to Yakuza, I think it's also a fair argument that these are pretty different, since Yakuza 7 uses timing to just benefit you a little more in either direction, whereas in Mario & Luigi Superstar Saga, the timing can be completely binary in its effect. You get hit or you don't. It's fun to gradually accumulate the knowledge to recognize the very first beat in a sequence, the start of an attack, any minute telegraph. But then every time I took a few days break from playing it, there's a good chance the rhythm I thought I was understanding proved itself to just be hard arrhythmia. I think for all these mentioned games that use timed input for turn-based combat, it really could get some of the traditional turn-based haters to stick around a little bit longer. Somehow it makes these games feel less tedious and samey, even as someone that loves these types of games regardless. Even in the fighting game Link, Thuggie, and I share, this idea is utilized in a similar way, whether it be nudges of Yakuza 7 or the full send of Superstar Saga. In Marvel vs. Capcom 3, some supers let you mash buttons to make it do significantly more damage. In Melty Blood, you can tap in a rhythm of their combo to reduce the damage. In Guilty Gear, Jam has to time the second hit of her bow super to get a clean hit, or she might miss and splat onto the wall, and so on. How could I possibly relate Mario & Luigi Superstar Saga to my good friend Thuggie? I feel like I formed most of my opinions when I linked the survey to my friends initially, and wanted to believe that my most basic boil down to them would at least be the thesis to each section. As long as I've known him, I've had the most fun and consistency diving into incredibly long-winded, sometimes genuinely tiresome discussions about any work of fiction or even real-world events. Did this character really mean this in that chapter or episode? Stuff like that. I guess in that vein, I assume there might be some weird lore or implications he wanted to pick apart in his favorite game, but I wouldn't say I particularly noticed anything like that here. This left me a bit stumped, so I wanted to look back at some ideas I explored earlier. Though as someone that possibly overvalues objectivity, I know that this game is a game that any person on Earth could hold on a pedestal for dozens, hundreds of reasons. I think most people would mention things like the pixel art, the constant environmental shifts, the music, the fourth wall breaks, just how self-aware the game seems to be. While I'm sure these are relevant factors to Thuggie, I don't think they're the main vein. In my humble opinion, there are two big attractors for someone like him. One, I think, comes down to the particular love that both of us have for violently mechanical things in games, or more specifically, the process of learning those mechanical things. Hell, both of us recently started learning Tekken because the knowledge ceiling for that game is absolutely insane. There's always 100 things to learn. Something feels incredibly good in Superstar Saga when you perfectly jump over an attack, then you time your hammer to smack away another, and then retaliate with the perfect bros attack timing to wipe them out. While definitely possible on reaction, consistency comes from experimenting with the timing, the weapon you're using, enemy knowledge. There was some sort of comfort playing through the game that some areas that were trickier for me, I knew that if I just knew a tiny bit more and was better at the game, I could mow through without taking a single point of damage. The other main pull, I believe, is just simply the interactability of the game. Typically in our fighting game lobbies, if someone beats everybody else, they go back to the end of the queue so other people can fight other matchups. Thuggie is physically incapable of this, however, and needs to be on at all times like a shark. Anytime we joke about this behavior, his response is usually along the lines of, well, why would I want to not play when I could be playing? Aggravatingly, this is a admittedly pretty waterproof concept, and one that I think really carries over into Mario & Luigi Superstar Saga. The game gives you control, even if only minor at times, absolutely whenever it can. As much as I can slog through long, mediocre games now as an adult because I don't like not giving something as fair of a shake as I can, I certainly couldn't say that about my younger self. The amount you just get to play the game here, I can only imagine would keep even the most Swiss cheese brain child engaged and intrigued. Whether it's the sheer playability of the game at face level or the amount you can dig deep into mastering its mechanics, there's really no question to me at all this could be somebody's favorite game. Even if Thuggie is a degenerate Eno player who only lies to you about hitting 5p, at the end of the day he's not only one of my favorite people to play any game with, but someone whose recommendations rarely require a grain of salt. We've arrived at the oldest game on the submitted list, at least as of the time of writing this part. Personally, and I feel like there's probably a lot of other people around in the same boat, I've only played through Symphony of the Night as far as actual Castlevania goes. What feels strange and will likely be a recurring theme for this section is that I've played a hell of a lot of games that exist because of Castlevania instead. While I'm aware this video is already relatively long, don't worry, I'm not about to video essay you to death by saying we have to go back and talk about Pong for 15 minutes before we can talk about Castlevania. I did consider doing that for comedic effect to just really drag it out and make it a miserable viewing experience, and I also considered just playing any clip of CJ molding at this game in Discord and moving on to the next game. Unfortunately for my antics, I've been good pals with CJ for a bit too long at this point after meeting in college to get away with not talking about his favorite game. I remember him being really excited about receiving drink coasters with the old Castlevania box art on them, and I also remember him freaking out when the Belmonts were announced for Smash Ultimate, even though he doesn't particularly care about that game. This hit high expectations for me, as I know I'm the same way for the games I care about the most. Funny enough, I remember freaking out when Terry Bogard, a character I think's insanely boring to play in his actual games, was announced for the same Smash game just because I love the King of Fighters. I'm running this intro before I even play the game for the first time, and the only thing I really know about it is that jump arcs can send you to hell and the final boss is a pain in the ass. I have wanted an excuse to watch the Castlevania animated series though, so at least there's that at the end of the tunnel. Alright, so let's go ahead and get knocked into the water for a few hours. One aspect of old games that I always really appreciated is how tethered the idea of difficulty is to numerical stages. I'm sure it sounds quite simple and basic that I'd mention the concept of games getting harder as they go along, but to be honest, I don't really think that applies to a lot of modern video games anymore. In recent memory, a lot of games I've played for the last handful of years sort of horse you around and you feel like an unkillable god by the end. This might be, again, if you remember last video, my love for grinding, and also don't worry, I'm not planning on getting into a new game bad, old game good rant. It's more so, I guess, an adoration for adding a new enemy or two per iteration without much fanfare, effectively adding mechanics in a sense. One of the most effective early examples of this in the game is the introduction of the Medusa heads as enemies from the second area onwards. While you initially run into them by themselves and get their rhythm down to be able to just walk straight through them, later stages and areas will add more enemies or platforms that change that established rhythm of the heads. Instead of being the main event in these newer encounters, for any rhythm game players, the Medusa heads are like a trill that part of your brain's operating around, but only serves as a foundation for the rest of the notes and variables coming your way. I went a little more in depth with this idea when talking about Mega Man Zero in the previous video, and a little bit of rhythm in the last game in this, so I'll lay off of it for now. The last thing I would say on that, however, is Castlevania feels more like a rhythm game to my hands than something like Mega Man X or Zero games, just because of the inability to alter your jump horizontally in the air. While I still believe there's plenty of skill in micro-adjusting in those games to just barely miss instant death, it's an entirely different ballgame in Castlevania. In the excellent parody fighting game Dive Kick, the user has two buttons, dive and kick, and you die in a single hit. For any unaware folks, it's in reference to many strong fighting game characters, especially during that 360 PS3 generation, having dive kicks that could both smother at point-blank pressure or bait out anti-airs causing you to get punished. Dive Kick takes this to a hyperbolic degree that getting hit by just one simply makes you lose. Anyways, small weird tangent aside, that game has some of the most instantaneous oops factor I've ever experienced because the microsecond you hit the wrong button, you feel it deep in your loins and just die immediately. Castlevania is right in the same feeling. There's an actual record scratch moment in your brain when you jump up to a platform, and only to see something flying full screen is going to knock your ass off, or when you brainlessly jump at a flea man or into a skeleton bone. While I really love this kind of experience in games personally, I definitely understand why it could be incredibly off-putting to some, and honestly I think it maybe is the biggest contributor to some people hating going back to older games, more so than the controls that I think are more commonly blamed. Now that I think about it, I could push this way forward in time and say that the Soul series has a lot of the same aspects of the oh no response, like panic rolling and watching in despair as the boss delayed his half-health attack animation. CJ also enjoys playing those games, so maybe that could be an applicable through line later on. I don't think it's controversial to say Castlevania is a pretty damn simple game in any sort of way you want to look at it. There's only a handful of enemy types, bosses, stages, and sub-weapons in the game, and I definitely believe someone who's played it a few times already could clear it in the time it takes for their food order to show up at the door. I think it's pretty easy anymore to look at a game's worth by its numerical values. How much stuff there is to do, how many numbers can go up, how many songs are on the digital soundtrack you won't even download. I don't think this is necessarily a horrible thing. There's so many games coming out at any given point anymore, it's a reasonable factor to consider which ones you're going to spend your money on. I know this is going to sound kind of strange when I make the comparison considering the developer's legacy, but the sheer amount Castlevania achieves with so little feels similar to me as the modern indie game boom. For me, the enemies are the best representation of this. The bats and birds make you worried about your diagonal vulnerability, the flea man your vertical in most cases, and the Medusa heads oscillate between them and so on. It would be easy to scoff at the enemy variety in this game as a lazy way to dismiss coming back to this game if you're used to the modern AAA splendor, but Castlevania so violently proves that there's no need for anything besides the basics. With the handful of enemies covering all sort of positional and reactionary checks, what would the point be exactly of reskinning them into something else just to pretend it's a new enemy? It's genuinely nice to walk into a new area of the game, see the layout and placement of enemies, and that's when the face value simplicity of Castlevania really begins to shine. The levels are meticulously turned into these constant little puzzles, complemented by the fact that in some areas the enemies are RNG, even if not that heavily so. One common scenario throughout the game is having a bone tower or a skeleton a bit ahead of you, then something like a Medusa head or a bat approaching from the same or the opposite direction. This faces you with the question of trying to jump between projectiles and try to turn around, snipe the other enemy out of the air, or maybe just try to rush down the tower and break its shots with your whip before the other thing gets to you, that sort of thing. To be honest, I feel like the incredibly committal jump means way more in these little enemy placement puzzles than basically any platforming sections, which is admittedly what I thought was going to be the case earlier in, so I was wrong there. And I think that fits really well with the fact that a lot of people consider this a difficult game. The committal jump is way more of a punishment for approaching a scenario wrong than just some outdated design concept. I think I made these little scenarios sound a bit too simple, but this is where the other tight intentional layer comes in, the sub-weapons. In the same way enemies sort of specialize in some dimension or another, the sub-weapons do so as well. The Holy Water is insane for hitting down diagonal, of which in my very amateur Castlevania opinion, you always kind of want to be above everything. The dagger is just sort of a better snipey version of your whip, the axe makes flying enemies completely trivial, and so on. This second huge chunk changes the puzzle aspect even more, where you can be in the same multi-enemy scenario I talked about before, but having a different sub-weapon severely warps what the answer could be. Combine this with small things like deciding if you want to stand on the stairs and guarantee you take damage but you don't take the knockback, and there's just an unfathomably simple elegance in navigating the castle. Thinking about this web of game design concepts made for one of the most interesting parts about Castlevania while playing it. While you could make a case for Pokemon or maybe even Wario from last video, I think more so than anything else, Castlevania's looked at backwards from the lens of games that came out after it. The very first game covered by this video series, Hollow Knight, is probably one of the most popular modern iterations of this idea, and I already had footage saved from that. That being said, there's a game that I think would be significantly more interesting to look at. In that midway through, Brad talks about another game part of the section. I hope you guys like big yummy beers, terrible art, and bike horns. More people with Touhou profile pictures have said slurs in public discourse than have actually played the games. For those fortunate enough to not be in the early 2000s forums, Touhou is a series of shmups created by one incredible alcoholic, Zune. I'm sure most people have seen how bad his character artwork is, and I'll show a few on screen. He also makes the hottest tracks of all time using the most annoying bike horns fathomable. I do like most of the actual Touhou games, by the way. I just think it's really fun and easy to clown on. So what does this have to do with Castlevania? What if, theoretically, the Touhou community is insanely dedicated, and while we're at it, what if Zune didn't really care at all what people do with his property? This is Touhou Luna Nights, and I'll spoil it immediately, that is probably by far my favorite Metroidvania game. While closer to Symphony of the Night for obvious reasons, the uncanny ability for Touhou fans to make an incredible game that's simultaneously a love letter to two things at once is impressive at the very least. I would dare say that the stopwatch is the most unique, interesting, and broken on paper item in Castlevania, even though it caves to the hilariously overpowered stun lock that Holy Water creates. So what if we made an entire game function around the stopwatch and all the interesting ways you can play with it? Saga Izayoi, the popular Touhou character who we control in this game, is famous for having time powers and plenty of bladed weapons, so she's sort of a perfect choice for the game. You can either slow time for a short period, or completely freeze it like the normal Castlevania stopwatch. Throwing knives, your main weapon, costs MP to use normally when time is stopped, though it subtracts from your time gauge instead. All the knives and other abilities stay frozen on screen and then all rip forward at once when time resumes, letting you effectively insta-kill normal enemies at the cost of having to wait a little while for your time to refill again. The interesting parts come from how the world reacts to the time freeze, however. Some platforms or hazards completely freeze, some only move during the freeze, some reverse their direction, water becomes a platform or a blockade, and so many other little fun interactions. Upgrades that you're going to get throughout the game also lets you do more fun things during the freeze, like knives that you can platform onto, with the double jump upgrade automatically dropping 2 knives under you to act as a small platform. These considerations don't even end from the Metroidvania side of things, but the game constantly reminds you it's a Touhou game. Graze, the shmup mechanic of getting extra points when barely skirting your hurt box on an enemy body or attack, is the only way to gain HP and MP back during combat. This adds another layer to when and how you use your time mechanics. When both you and the boss are low on HP, do you use your time freeze to freeze their bullet pattern and get free grazes to restore your resources, or should you use it to try to squeeze out that final bit of damage? This puzzle-like approach is just as strong in Luna Nights as it is in Castlevania, with that same severe ramp-up in difficulty 2/3 of the way into the game, where the time freeze just isn't even a catch your breath button anymore. Plenty of the sub-weapons in the game are also very similar, I think at face value, especially the chainsaw just being the axe. I've almost entirely talked about the mechanics of Touhou Luna Nights, and for good reason. I'd mentioned it earlier on, but it's so hard to separate, at least to me, Castlevania and those things that came out after it. In a time of games being released where it's immediately parroted online for being iterative, a rip-off, lazy, etc., I think it's really odd people, including myself, to be fair, forget how good we have it in this medium anymore in most regards. I don't think it's a particularly bad idea to take the basis of something good that you like and just add more stuff you think might be interesting. While sure, this spawns a lot of janky cash grab Unity engine garbage onto the Steam store, I sincerely don't think many games have ever caused as many good indie projects afterwards as Castlevania has. I think basically anyone in our friend group would call CJ and me pretty cynical for this sort of thing, in particular the now nearly meaningless tags of Metroidvania or Souls-like. While I'm tempted to try a lot of these new releases with those labels on them, playing the first Castlevania game really made it clear to me why some of those work and others just feel completely devoid of anything. Replaying Luna Nights for that little chunk of footage after playing through Castlevania really demonstrated to me how looking backwards helps, and I think this is where I also see why this game could be so important to CJ. Luna Nights and the other popular recent games like Hollow Knight, Dead Cells, and Bloodstained are in part incredible because they keep a lot of that core aspect of its predecessor. Puzzly, short, punishing games that treat themselves like a video game, nothing more grand than that, and despite having a lot of content, still they don't feel like they have any fat at all. Because you see, Castlevania is a video game-ass video game. One of the very first things I learned about CJ when I first was introduced to him is that he's physically incapable of watching cutscenes. He squirms in his seat when a tutorial lasts longer than just how to jump and move, and has a hardwired limit of how many menus a game is allowed to have. Funny enough, this sort of calls back to Thuggie's game of how inherently playable the whole thing is. You can open up the Castlevania Anniversary Collection on Steam, and within 15-20 seconds you're walking up to the castle gate. When I think about other games he really likes, I could probably make a similar case for plenty of them. For as long as I've known CJ, he's been pretty consistently focused on his criteria for any sort of media work. For him, a movie has to be good at movie stuff, and a video game has to be good at video game stuff. When I look at Castlevania from the question, well, does it do video game stuff well? And the answer is hell yes, it does. This section's been very difficult for me to write or put into any remote semblance of a profound conclusion, because there's no other way to describe it than being a perfectly crystallized ball of video game. Sure, both of us vocally enjoy being angry, probably more than someone should strive for, so adding that punishing layer that Castlevania or something like the Soul series has makes them even more appealing to both CJ and myself. Being probably by far the biggest retro game fan I know personally, CJ values short, engaging, simple to pick up and play games that can be replayed ad nauseum, and I really can't find a single thing wrong with that. At the end of the day, I could try to sound smart in these videos for hours and hours at a time, but they're just video games. You don't have to put on your pretentious evaluation helm to just hit the damn start button and have fun for an hour or two. I think it's really important to have people in your life that are very straightforward with what they like, what they're looking for, how they feel. In that regard, CJ's been one of the best ham-fisted friends I could have. Alright, I can't let this end on a sappy note or anything for CJ, so in honor of our critical nature, I'll now say something bad about Castlevania. If you stumbled on this and don't know me personally, just don't take this super seriously. The theme and setting of Castlevania is super replaceable, and it could be literally anything else with no issues. Also, vampires are for dweebs. This game has actually been in my backlog for a while, and for a long time around its release. Even now, sometimes it was impossible to watch a long-form video about games and not see this game mentioned. I made sure to avoid the game as much as possible because I knew I'd get around to it eventually in my nightmarishly growing backlog. Even when Tim was streaming this game, I kept it muted and out of sight just to kind of support the homie with views. It's also a little funny that this is the first game that I'm editing where I'll need to try to be careful not to show any spoilers, so if I mess up, sorry. For that very reason, most of the footage I'm going to show should be relatively early into the various plans as to not show a little bit more of their hand. I know it isn't the most sound or agreed upon argument, but I have to sort of share my thought process for something like this. I think going into games, movies, and shows completely blind is sort of the ideal way for anyone to truly experience them. But on the other end, I'm a firm believer that in most cases, spoilers don't devalue or ruin anything. If a spoiler like a character dying or Deus Ex Machina completely turns you off from starting something, in my opinion, that thing probably wasn't worth your time to begin with then. Now that Tim has already clicked off the video and or thrown his hands into the air in frustration after that, we can start talking about Outer Wilds. Despite how much I tried to skirt around spoilers for the game, I at the very least understood the core concept. You're a rookie astronaut launching into space for the first time, but every 20 minutes or so, the world completely resets, with you miraculously Steins Gating or Groundhog Daying your way out of it, whichever reference you prefer. While something like Castlevania you'll inevitably run into for its legacy, Outer Wilds is something that you'll run into for its weird placement in the current landscape of games. Just doing a quick search online, there are plenty of threads around begging for game recommendations that are, quote, like Outer Wilds. In those threads, a lot of the recommendations are prefaced with the quote, well, it isn't exactly like Outer Wilds, but... And to be honest, that's a fair caveat. For lack of a better description, Outer Wilds is kind of a pretentious game, and I immediately don't want that to come off as any sort of disdain or active criticism, and I know there are significantly more self-brain-sitting games that people will talk about. Maybe that perception stems from how people try to explain why Outer Wilds is such a unique game worth playing. This was the only game so far I really dug into public opinion of after playing what I considered enough of the game to go do so. A common pitch or idea surrounding this game seems to be that the game is incredibly driven by the player's curiosity more than any grand overarching narrative. I would definitely agree in theory. I'm sure plenty of people that tried and loved the game had fun just zooming off in a direction to the next planet or obvious landmark, or staring at a strange structure trying to figure out how and even if they can interact with it. Personally, and I don't know if I'm in the minority or not here, I feel like I played it pretty checklist style. One of the first NPCs in Hearth, the starting planet you'll return to each loop, recommended starting at the planet's very own moon, Addlerock, so I did just that. Addlerock works effectively as a tutorial in multiple ways, the main one being the obvious fact that it's the closest thing to land on once you take off at Hearth within, like, 10 seconds. The other aspect is that it's the only planet without some sort of gimmick you have to figure out. These gimmicks in other planets include stuff like Brittle Hollow slowly collapsing into its black hole core while being pelted by its moon, Giant's Deep with its sweeping tornadoes and taking shelters in islands, or Dark Bramble being the only source of jump scares in the entire game. When I say I played pretty checklist style, I mean that I usually tended to try to squeeze as much out of a single planet as I could over multiple loops before daring to go on to the next one. The intensity of which I explored each loop, however, is what I found to be one of the greatest strengths of Outer Wilds in my humble opinion. Progress is really gauged on how I felt during any particular iteration. Some sessions with the game, I'd have a set path in my head of exactly where I was going and what I was going to try to look at, and try to get 3 or 6 entries in the ship log in that single loop. Other times, however, even on that very same planet, I was just looking to kill a quick 20 minutes before a work meeting or something, hoping I'd just find one thing while mindlessly jetpacking around a low-gravity area for a bit. Even then, one of these styles would sometimes transform into the other. I distinctly remember just bumbling around in Brittle Hollow for the hell of it, only to finally find a fellow spacefarer, Rebek, who pointed me in the direction of the Hanging City, of which I immediately went full tilt on exploring as quickly and thoroughly as I could before my time limit ran out. Only just starting to read another wall of text logs there, I heard the distinct boom in the distance, signaling that I only had a few minutes before my dinky astronaut helmet would be engulfed in the pale blue. I rushed to mash out the rest of the dialogue into my ship log, promising myself to actually come read it slower when I had more time, only to no avail, leaving my ship log the next morning with that dreaded asterisk that I didn't collect all the information I could have. So do I spend my day going back to Brittle Hollow, maybe see if there are more dialogue options for Rebek, or do I think I squeezed enough out of the planet for now and just finally move on to the next? This is a question that the game is constantly asking the player, and while you could say there are only 2 answers to it, often it sort of feels like there are more. Talking about Outer Wilds feels immensely hypocritical after one of my conclusions of discussing Castlevania, and that being, I don't really think games need to be looked at through a jeweler's loop just to say it's good or interesting. With Outer Wilds, however, it feels like it's almost the only way to really talk about it. I feel like, contrary to Castlevania, I have almost nothing to talk about gameplay-wise, and much to say about the actual atmosphere and experience of the game. Mechanically, there's not much more here than a standard walking sim style game aside the admittedly satisfying momentum between your jetpack and the ship itself. Narrative wise, and maybe I'll get some flack for this, I don't know, it seemed pretty straightforward and simple to figure out once you found a handful of those more important clues, though it was certainly compelling enough still to actually take the time to read all the logs and carvings I would find. You see, the narrative of Outer Wilds isn't really a breadcrumb trail like a lot of more open stories and games tend to be, but rather a few piles of breadcrumbs that are kind of near each other. For a very high-level explanation, the Outer Wilds has you exploring the universe to find traces of the Nomai, a technically advanced race that predates you, and to piece together what exactly happened to them. By exploring the various planets, you come across written logs, mostly in a sort of lab recording style of many various Nomai conversing, of which you'll recognize a few names overlapping. There are a handful of major events in their history, of which many other things you find are going to weave around. And as you would imagine, this is also intimately entangled with the entire time loop phenomenon going on. One of the more interesting things to me about this setup is the fact that you start at Hearth each and every loop by the exact same campfire, unchanging even when you try to bring up the time loop to the laid-back and easygoing townsfolk. You can go from desperately trying to avoid tornadoes on Giant's Deep, or leaping from crumbling piece to crumbling piece, avoiding the black hole of Brittle Hollow, and then just immediately cut back into staring at the same sky from Hearth. This is like if you lost the inevitable fight with God at the end of a JRPG, only to respawn at your sleepy, woodwind instrument-backed home village. Speaking of which, you'll notice that talking about this game will be the first, and maybe only time, that I don't really talk about any particular game that I personally love or thought of while I was playing it. See, the forums I referenced earlier on of people trying their best to fill a void that Outer Wilds left are not alone in their inability to really come up with any sort of equivalent. Return of the Obra Dinn, the Myst series, the Forgotten City, the Witness, even Hollow Knight I've seen mentioned, but almost always again with that caveat I had mentioned of not really being like Outer Wilds. The closest one that I found recommended frequently was the excellent Subnautica, which even Tim did play and enjoy, but even that I feel like really doesn't have that many parallels. The thing they have most in common, in my opinion at least, is some of the sound design. Subnautica is scarier to me than most any actual horror game because the sound is just so incredibly well done. The tension's completely palpable when you head into areas of the vast ocean. You hear both familiar and unfamiliar sounds all around you at varying distances and heights. It's possibly one of the only games I've ever played where I felt like I got my money's worth out of my embarrassingly expensive audio setup at my computer, though that is mostly for music purposes, I guess. Outer Wilds doesn't exactly use its sound the same way in my opinion. It holds itself back quite a bit more, twiddling its fingers in delight when the only thing you can hear besides the occasional muffled thruster is your character breathing in the helmet. This breath, while very simple, sure, can set the tone of your exploration pass without even changing its own. On one of these slow loops when you're just looking around for areas you haven't checked, your breath is a steady, constant that you can keep your tempo to. On the other hand, you may find something incredibly bizarre, an area that for a brief moment you think you're the only player on Earth to have ever found, with the breath the lone, tense atmosphere before maybe, just maybe, an actual music track plays to break it apart. As you've probably been able to tell so far, it's been a little frustrating for me that I've been unable to sort of explain to myself, let alone you, what Outer Wilds is. It's not some grand in scale, perception warping narrative with complex up and downs. But it's difficult to just ignore the story because you're not sure what discoveries you find do and don't really relate to the Nomai until you get there. It's not some sort of backtracking Metroidvania where you simply are not allowed to go to certain areas until you get some sort of upgrade because you never gain new equipment and only learn through finding some information somewhere or just trial and erroring your way to understanding a particular puzzle or planet mechanism. Nothing is ever explicitly unreachable for you. You can gun for the ending of the game in a single loop. The devs even want you to know that because it's an unlockable achievement. The signal scope and the completed map you start with I wouldn't even call necessary to find everything, but more so are nice additions to add a little more texture to the characters you meet and interact with, their personalities somewhat reflected by the instrument they broadcast through the stars. There's health and there's oxygen and fuel, but it's impossible to call this game a survival game either, with only a mere 20 minutes you would have to do that for. Outer Wilds is an exploration game, but having absolutely zero combat of any type also separates it in my brain from other games I could call similar. As lazy as it may sound, Outer Wilds is the type of game that you make it. It's a relaxing place to look at spectacle after spectacle while doing other stuff at your computer, or it's a feverish run of optimization and just understanding. Not to make this project sound like a chore because it isn't, sure it takes away some time from stuff I want to be making progress on, but the process of expanding the types of games I play through what close friends are into is incredibly rewarding and opened more doors in the medium that I previously closed off for various reasons. This variability in how casually or intensely I could play Outer Wilds really helped with that, because it more or less equated to how motivated or unmotivated I was that day to work on all of this. I'd keep the game audio quite loud, constantly consulting the signal scope and sending scouts to find things on days I really wanted to write some notes down. Other times, I'd listen to an album or watch a comfort movie while aimlessly trying to see if I could manually land on the trickier spots of the universe. I didn't really start this series to try to figure out how to describe what a game is, however, but more so to relate it back to my friends that claim their submissions to be their favorite single-player games of all time, in this case, Tim. Like most people I've been doing this project with and for so far, it's no surprise that I've known Tim for a handful or two of years. I've sort of watched the shift of him focusing on more competitive multiplayer stuff to cruising through some notable recent indie games while streaming on the side, such as Outer Wilds itself. One thing I immediately thought of while playing this game, connecting it to my buddy Tim, was how of all the friends and people I know, he's one of the people most likely to just accept some random plan or invitation with little to no hesitation or further questions. Each and every planet in Outer Wilds is that invitation to come and see what the hell's going on, promising an experience with a healthy mix of good and bad, and if you go in completely blind, those aspects are even more amplified. The only expectations are the little snippets that NPCs mention about those planets. One of the only ones I really noticed upon my immediate mosey around Hearth was a character saying he'd love to go fish at Giant's Deep, which, combined with the name, told me it's probably an ocean-covered type beat. Being opposite to Tim in that regard, I was very hesitant to move to the next planet unless enough logs on the planet I was currently on mentioned it enough. Guess I was craving at least some semblance of comfortability with it, knowing that it is in fact where I'm supposed to go, despite the game setup clearly giving the green light for anywhere at any time. Tim, similar to Thuggie, is someone that I've spent a lot of time talking to about game stories and mechanics as well as movies, anime, whatever. I had mentioned his aversion to spoilers in the beginning of the section, and while poking fun at it a bit myself, I think this is also an area of Outer Wilds that could be so enticing to Tim playing through it. The gameplay loop and setup of the game sort of invalidates spoilers much more strongly than most games I can think of, I guess with the exception being the actual ending of the game. If someone tells you about one of the major modules of the plot, for lack of a better term, that's merely one of many. It means nothing at all in its own monolithic spot. It also means almost nothing without the context around it, and to build up to it by finding a handful or more other small clues before it makes itself meaningful. It's a little bit of the enjoy the journey, not the destination type of thing. Even with the same destination, I guarantee everyone who has played Outer Wilds has at least one story to tell about a loop that just really stuck in their brains and felt unique to them. The beauty of the lore and story of Outer Wilds is that everything is so closely knit, yet simultaneously feels so incredibly far apart, just jumping from planet to planet that, despite being only maybe 30 seconds in-game flight between each other. It's something that only a video game could achieve. So sure, at the end of the day, I can't quite nail down what kind of game Outer Wilds is. It's a bit too versatile of an experience, branching and reaching out in so many directions yet never feeling alien to its own identity. Similarly, I never quite know what I'm going to get into when spending time with and talking with Tim, but whether it's something I'm comfortable with or not, it's something I'll always have fun with, and for better or worse, there will be a story attached. I'm aware I already baited Armored Core Last Raven last episode, and this is not exactly that, but I have a few decent reasons for it. I want you to understand I started writing script after script for the series, let alone just that one entry, way before this video series even popped into the more reasonable portion of my brain. I don't think it's unreasonable for an inconsistent perfectionist to want to do right by what they more than often consider to be the most influential video game series in their life. Time and time again, I found myself erasing line upon line because it just felt like I was trying to impress a crowd that doesn't necessarily exist, a boogeyman that doesn't even exist in the contrarian forums I've spent so many years of life browsing. For the strangers that algorithm their way onto this video series, it may be less apparent, but I love engineering in every capacity. I knew I wanted to build stuff as soon as 4th grade, around the same time I understood I wanted to be a dad at some point in my life. After demolishing every honors, AP, class, whatever in high school that was associated with it, I came to a cruel realization in actual college that maybe I wasn't geared towards what I loved. Could I have worked harder? Yeah, I didn't have to sing along to songs we love or mash buttons with people in my freshman dorm. I didn't touch the Armored Core franchise until I was in arguably the lowest point of my life a few years into college, 2015, 2016, something like that. I was incredibly angry. I slept around, I picked fights with random people. I'd either exercise until it felt like my bones wouldn't accept their working conditions, or I'd drink enough to forget those bones existed. I'm not looking for pity or anything. I know I was in the wrong and I was lashing out, but I want to frame my relationship with Armored Core in the most honest way I can. Ideally, this is the most personal this series ever gets, but even I have limits, so let's talk about the most important series From Software has ever done. Armored Core 4 Answer is not my favorite Armored Core game. It might barely skirt into the top 3 behind Last Raven and Silent Line. But in that time period of my life, it was the first one of the series I actually played, aside a few skirmishes with some of the old PlayStation demo discs back in the day. If you aren't an Armored Core fan, or especially if you don't know anything about the series, you might be surprised to learn it was From Software's baby before the Soulsborne series. You know, that series YouTubers have baited you into thinking is the most punishing, unforgiving, funny rage clip series on Earth. I don't want anything I say to sound like a complaint or dig at the Soul series. By the way, I like a vast majority of those games, and I'm incredibly happy that FromSoft was able to get a genuine foothold in the global market thanks to them. Another detail I think is pretty important when watching this is that since this game kind of runs like Dookie on both consoles it was on, even the PS3 emulator will have some frame rate, cutscene, and texture problems, so don't worry too much if you see any of that here. Armored Core 4 as a series consists of only 2 main parts, Armored Core 4 and Armored Core 4 Answer, which this segment is about, and it's one that's surprisingly controversial among fans of the series. I don't want to really get in-depth with that until I finally have the balls to write about the Armored Core 3 line, including Last Raven. I've accepted my YouTube magnum opus was going to be this 5-hour-long love letter to that Armored Core 3 series that will have the lowest views imaginable. For the uninitiated, Armored Core 4 really peeled away from series standards. I'd imagine more people are familiar with the Soul series at this point, and I'd more or less equate Armored Core 4 and 4 Answer to Bloodborne in the sense that a significantly heavier emphasis put on Twitch reaction and it feels noticeably more agile. Well, they also both have terrible frame rates and have deserved a good port for like a decade, so there is that too between them. I feel the genuine need to boil it down to that sort of comparison because I think my rambling of a favorite game in the first part was kind of overstaying its welcome, so I want to be a little more concise. In addition, I don't really want to go too in-depth on the story of 4 Answer, not that it isn't somewhat interesting, but because I want to get this video out before Armored Core 6 comes out, which was announced while I was still pretty early into this video, and I think the closest I've ever been to having a heart attack. One little fun fact I will mention before we get started is that this is the first game that Miyazaki fully directed, so Patches is actually in this game as a pilot, Patch the Good Luck, and don't worry, he's also a slippery coward here. This may seem like a backhanded compliment, but Armored Core might be the only series I can think of where the gameplay is the least exciting part. It's not that it's bad, and not even remotely so. In fact, all the games feel pretty solid once you get behind the eldritch control scheme of the earlier gens. They didn't even really add analog support until 4 years into the PS2 with Nexus. Instead, the garage is actually where an Armored Core fan's happy place is, so to speak. While there are many appeals to the series, the customization and tweaking is just absolutely unmatched to me, even in the first couple of games where it's relatively limited. For those who aren't familiar, the gameplay loop of Armored Core generally consists of 20 minutes in the garage, fail a mission in 2 minutes, go back to the garage for 20, fail a mission in 3 minutes, and kind of so on until you finally complete the mission, only for you to see that you actually used so much ammo and got hit so many times you actually owe money for this mission. That probably sounds pretty miserable to some people that haven't really touched the series, but it's the same sort of trial and error a lot of people expect out of From Software, but it's more front-loaded instead of back-loaded like I'd consider the Soul series to kind of be. Oh, you didn't read the mission description? Sorry, bub, you should have had hover legs and flares so you don't get swarmed by missiles over the water. You brought only low ammo rockets to destroy a lot of stationary turrets in a factory? Well, sure, it would be a shame if a fast AC shows up to stop you and you can't get that lock at all, even if you did have ammo left over. Armored Core games require you to factor in a lot of variables per mission to get it done reasonably. Your AC feels like your own pet project that you tweak and obsess over. That isn't to say there isn't an absurd amount of personal spin on your AC, however, and in most of the games there are plenty of missions that with good piloting you can use whatever you consider to be your sort of baseline build. Tank legs, hover legs, quad legs, back-mounted swarm missiles, railguns, sniper rifles, energy rifles, shotguns. There's an unbelievable amount of customization here that not even considering the mind-boggling amount of cool numbers you can look at. Camos, patterns, emblems, custom paints, even the visual and aesthetic customization can lead you down a hobbyist rabbit hole. This game wants you to mess with stuff so badly, there are even plenty of counterweights to put on your build because your turn radius, turn speed, max speed in different directions are all affected by the weight distribution of your guns and other parts. It may not sound like it, but I'm trying very hard to omit an incredible amount of other stuff here. To sort of twist this on the defensive now, this is my main and probably only real complaint with Armored Core 4 Answer. If you've been watching the footage of the game, it's fast, really fast, and I'm not even remotely good at this game. The speed of the game and how nearly every AC, or next in this game, can permanently fly as opposed to the constant bunny hopping of older games means that you can just sort of avoid most forms of danger. And don't expect to see much advanced tech from me, such as second stage chain boosting. I'll try to remember to share some impressive gameplay by real PvP 4 Answer heads in the description if you're curious. Because of the insane movement tech, builds, for the most part, don't really matter in this game for the single player stuff, at least compared to previous entries in the series. However, this is the Armored Core game where the gameplay is absolutely supreme. The positive side to this, at least, is that you can spend even more time playing with the exact build you want to, and it'll probably work for most missions, at least on normal difficulty, without changing out for parts. I also don't want all the numbers and parts to intimidate you or anything. You can just kind of pick a few obvious values to compare and make a very simple build. Like in most Armored Core games, when all else fails, you can just brute force through with a medium weight bipedal build with 2 machine guns. Though there were certainly hardware limitations at play, especially during this weird period of Japanese dev catch-up time adjusting to these HD tools, everything outside of the gameplay of 4 Answer is nearly a direct cut down to compensate for the player maneuverability. There's little to no HUD, almost every single map is a big gray leveled city, concrete blob, or barren wasteland, and the menus look like what you'd expect to see on a knockoff MP3 player trying to look modern in 2008. But while playing the game, I'm not looking at my HUD 90% of the time. I don't look at the map unless I can see a slightly higher sand dune to gain some upward momentum before my bipedal reverse joint legs send me to heaven. There are so many tracers, rockets, beam flares, so much more flooding the screen constantly, especially in fights against fellow nexts. Everything else would just be a distraction. Am I coping by covering for the emptiness in one of my favorite games? Absolutely, but this is the game. As much as I want to gush about the game, there are plenty of valid criticisms against it, and boy did review sites sure not pull any punches on release. That being said, this game was sort of the first real attempt by FromSoft to somewhat reach modern, at the time, game conventions and quality of life. This is the first Armored Core game to my memory that has an actual tutorial, as basic as it may be, instead of just throwing your ass into battle to figure it out. It also lets you select a corporation to start with, which decides your starting parts and general build path, with even the option to select Independent, which is more or less akin to selecting Deprived in the Souls game. As a very quick gloss over of the plot, 4 Answer lays a similar groundwork to most Armored Core games, and even seems to be the case for the upcoming 6th mainline game. The world sucks, everything's destroyed, large corporations are really the only world power left, and they're constantly at each other's necks. Humans, provided they're rich and or important enough, live in these massive self-sufficient ships called cradles, high above the barren wasteland they used to live on. You even find yourself slaying the protagonist you played as in Armored Core 4, who was, by Armored Core standards at least, a good guy. This is even reflected in the respective themes, Thinker for Anatolia's Mercenary in 4 and Scorcher for you, Straight in For Answer, representative of how you're continuing to spiral what remains of the world into ashes. There are 3 distinct paths and endings in the game, only one of which you can get on your initial playthrough, which, while it pales in comparison to my beloved Last Raven's whopping 7, feels distinctly Miyazaki. You can really feel his design and storytelling philosophy here. You, simultaneously nobody, but also kind of the most important character, choose what happens to what remains of the world. And I gotta say, the worst ending you can get for For Answer, arguably, is probably the most memorable ending in an Armored Core game I can think of, as you horrifically shoot down cradle after cradle, plunging the rest of humanity into darkness, the haunting dialogue of Old King counting the millions of lives lost. Armored Core For Answer is bleak, hollow, barren, it's hilariously snappy and fast. I played it at a very important time in my life, but what makes it one of my favorite games? Unlike a lot of my favorite games, I find it quite difficult to recommend Armored Core games to people. They're tedious, clunky, antiquated, and bizarre. You basically have to emulate them until 6 finally hits modern consoles including PC, and even then a lot of them are really fiddly, especially on 7th gen emulators. I don't have any sort of artistic way to explain why they feel so incredible, as you grow more and more accustomed to the strange controls and movement, more accustomed to experimenting with things you find on missions or buy in the store. Armored Core as a series is one for dedicated hobbyists, not just for mech fans like myself, but people that just really want to dig deep into seeing how they can make certain builds and theories come to fruition. For Answer in particular places a lot of skill on the universal mechanics, letting even the most dilapidated, uneven build dance and weave around helpless MTs and even twerk on arms forts, the large boss equivalents of the game. Maybe I picked For Answer here because I'm hoping AC6 has a similar degree of freedom, movement tech, and amount of parts and weapons. Maybe I picked it because I think it's the most accessible and, on the surface, exciting looking to try to lure people into the meat of the franchise, especially the 3rd gen. Maybe I picked it because Kota Hoshino's soundtracks, like having the intro rave scene to the Blade movie, spattering battery acid instead of blood. I think I picked it because at the time in my life that I played it, it entered me into a series of games with the right lesson at the right time. I can't just force everything to work out for me because I wanted to, or because I think I deserve it. I had to helplessly search around and flail wildly to replace the parts of myself and my AC to take on the things I was ignoring for a long time, whether due to thinking I was better than it or it wasn't important enough to warrant it. While I learned to take a breath, spend some time tweaking and looking at the values I could control, I'd like to think the core remained the same, and I really hope that means something. Sorry that got kind of weird and personal again at the end, but I guess if it works, maybe, just maybe, you're slightly more interested in trying out Armored Core 6 when it comes out this coming fall. If you want to try something close to the feel of Armored Core 4 Answer but on legal platforms, Daemon X Machina is on basically everything, and if you skip all the genuinely horrible story, it actually has a lot of devs from Armored Core 4 on it that have a similar snappy, frantic feel to it. Thank you so much for spending another huge block of time watching this, and try out some of your friends' favorite games.